I'm not one to shy away from admitting that I do enjoy the occasional mechanical keyboard. I have, after all, made a number of videos on these lovely input devices over the past few years. But never have I ever dared to get close to what I now consider to be keyboards honoring the term custom much more than those I previously would have called so. Even though my choice, which is the Boardsource Unicorne, is just as simple in assembly as any other mechanical keyboard. But regardless of the build process, I always shied away from keyboards such as these, as I deemed the transition to be too much of a hassle, and my lack of knowledge made this segment seem much more complicated than it actually turned out to be. So after a little over 2 months of using an ortholinear split mechanical keyboard, here's what I learned, what I think about it, and why I believe I might just stay within this realm, even if it's still very painful sometimes. First, for those of you who do not know what an ortholinear split keyboard is, let's run through some basics as to what, why, where, and how this came to be. As always, I left chapter markers down below, so if you are interested in a particular segment, like just my thoughts on the Boardsource Unicorne, then feel free to jump to that section right away. Let's start with the ortholinear layout. If you watched any video on this topic, you'll probably have heard that the origin story of these staggered keys came from the old typewriters. It was a necessity in order to have straight levers that could then hammer down on the strip of ink. But just like any bad fashion trends, for example Birkenstock, this stuck around and is now the standard on almost every keyboard. However, ortholinear believers will argue that having the keys in perfect verticality will yield health benefits, as your fingers will move up and down in a more natural way as opposed to the slight angle. Now, depending on the amount of keys at your disposal, you're still going to have to do that, but a lot less. Then there's the split nature of these, which isn't tied to the ortholinear layout. There are plenty of split staggered boards as well. Having the keyboard split up enables your arms to rest in a much more natural position and decreases the amount of inward crouching your shoulders do. Most often on split keyboards you will also see something called tenting, which refers to having the board angled upwards on the inside, again to cater more to the natural position of your body, kinda like the insole on Birkenstocks. But most often when you see ortho, you'll see split, probably because both try to improve the ergonomics, so they sort of go hand in hand. So let's talk about those, or in particular, let's talk about Corne keyboards. When I entered the split ortholinear mechanical keyboard dimension, I quickly realized that the custom term I used for mechanical keyboards up until then seemed almost laughable in comparison now. Whereas with those several hundreds to $1,000 boards, you essentially only choose between 3 parts, that is the board, the switches and the keycaps. In the split ergo space, there are people literally creating boards from scratch. After my first tour, I generally thought I entered an alternate dimension with some of the craziest input devices I've ever seen, one more impressive and weirder than the other, and I absolutely loved it. Heck, some hero person even made an interactive builder. Need more keys for your thumb? Let's add some. How about a function row? Maybe another column on the inside, and let's say a single key on the top edge. Done. Or go even more bananas and use the camera on your phone to scan your hands in order to see if your fingers will be able to reach everything. I've seen many things in my life, but this is definitely one of the craziest and most amazing projects. I don't know how well it works though, but I feel like this needs to be verified in a future video. It's also not the only designer out there, there are plenty more, but this one is certainly the freakiest. After you have your case, it's off to the press or 3D printers, and then you'll have to order the PCB, which depending on your design, you'll have to make from scratch as well. This all may seem very daunting at first. It did for me, but I quickly also realized that they were at the very deep end of the pool, whereas I was just starting to get my feet wet. Lucky for me though, there are plenty of options out there meant for single-digit IQ people like myself. So I backed off from those crazy looking boards, as exciting as they were, and put my inflatable armbands on and jumped into the shallow end. I went for what appeared to be a popular and easy enough looking layout, the Corne. This is an open source design by a Mr. Kosuke Adachi, also known as Fusten, both names I'm very sure I just botched. Corne, also sometimes referred to as CRKBD for Corne Keyboard, is in its standard configuration a 3-row by 6-column keyboard with a thumb cluster of 3 keys. In more traditional terms, this is roughly a 40% keyboard, meaning you're going to have to deal with a lot of layers, but more on those softer shenanigans later. Since this is an open source design, there are many versions of this out there and a lot of ways on how to get your hands on one. You could opt to go and take the original design and go the self-printing route again, along with either a prefabricated PCB or self-designed and or modified one before assembling and wiring everything up. But as you might have already guessed, I'm not patient enough for that approach and thus went with the easiest possible path. Basically, I bought a finished board and just put it together. Theoretically, there's an even easier way to one-off the pre-built, but where's the fun in that? A place with plenty of options is Etsy. Yes, that Etsy, where among other things you can also find alternatives to Birkenstocks, by the way. But apart from questionable fashion choices, there are also plenty of Corne and other keyboards to be found there, sometimes even versions that might be exclusive to the preferences of the builder, or modified wireless versions of otherwise tethered boards. But even that was too adventurous for me, so instead I opted to go with the offerings of a company, one that seems to specialize in making these, called Boardsource. Here I ended up with the Unicorne, a wired Corne keyboard with full-sized MX switches and keycaps. I originally wanted to go low profile, which Boardsource does offer as well, but I decided to stay with MX for cost reasons, as I could leverage my existing stockpile of switches and caps. If you've built any keyboard before, you're going to find yourself right at home here. In the box is the aluminum case, a layer of foam, plates and the PCBs. Switches can be ordered with it as well, but like I already mentioned, I have plenty of those. Same goes for the keycaps, where I reused my Monokai Series 1s, even though I am missing quite a few specialized caps for this build, so just ignore the labeling. The only noticeable difference during the build process is probably the add-ons, such as the little displays or the tenting poles. Let's talk about those poles for a second. They are not mandatory, but as mentioned, you're going to find these or something similar in almost all of the Cornish boards. Essentially, they are the equivalent of the flip-out feet on a more traditional keyboard. They also differ by lifting the board on the inside rather than on the back, giving your hands a more natural rotation, and I for one cannot type without them anymore. On the Unicorne, they are simply attached by being screwed into the back. A small but clever detail here is the use of rubber to have the board stick to the surface without them, while simultaneously securing the poles when they are being screwed in. There are no additional or granular adjustments you can make here. You can either go camping or remain at home. The displays aren't mandatory either if you ask me, but this will differ from person to person. Some might deem these to be essential, and even though I am in the vanity camp, I'm not going to hand them over anymore either. They can be used to show a number of metrics, such as typing speed, active layers, dates, heck even minigames. The world of display customization is worth a deep dive in itself. Per default, the Unicorne will show the active layer on the left half. The right display just seemed to do, well, nothing out of the box, but more on how I got Bongo up there in a minute. Let's put this thing together first. The process is fantastically easy. Place the foam, snap the PCB plate and switches together and add the little displays, probably the most finicky part of the build, and finish with the windshields. These little plastic windows are the only negative construction mark I'm going to give the Unicorne. Reason being that they're only secured on one side, leaving quite a bit of potential stress on the mounting holes when being pressed on. This is the primary reason why I will probably never take this board with me to the office. I fear these might break while being in my backpack, tumbling around and getting crushed by other items of lesser fragility. A case might help, but I haven't found one yet. The screens that come with the Unicorne, if you select the $12 add-on, have a resolution of 32 by 128, but there are also plenty of more options depending on what kind of board you have, with higher resolutions or even full color. Again, the world of keyboard displays is vast and way too much for me to cover here. I'm also still very new to these, so I don't feel comfortable talking about them just yet. Overall though, this was arguably one of the fastest and easiest assemblies I had ever undertaken. One reason for that is the complete lack of any stabilizers, which I'm going to give big points to. The last step was to connect the two halves using the supplied C2C cable. Here I believe there is a bit of a deviation from the original Corne design that used a TRS or TRRS cable. I feel indifferent about this, but USB-C is likely to be something you might have at home already, and therefore if you seek a wider configuration or have a cable already, you can just use that one and deselect the option during the ordering process. Fully set up, I adore the looks of the Unicorne. I think it is among the best looking Cornes I've seen, and in my opinion, the complete opposite of a pair of Birkenstocks. For the curious ones, I did have a second board in my top list, the Corne from Typeractive, which is even wireless and low profile. It looks pretty amazing too, and might even be a contender for me to take to the office. Now, compared to some of the highest end boards that I was lucky enough to play around with over the years, the Unicorne will not match the machining nor the finishing on those. There are details less refined here, and for the base price of $233, I would hope for a little better, but still, overall, I love this build. It feels very solid, and due to its minuscule size, it actually sounds pretty good too. Alright, it's time to talk about the software. The Unicorne comes preloaded with QMK, the same firmware running on most other custom boards if you're familiar with those. It does this on an RP2040 chip. Yes, a Raspberry Pi, which I before owning this keyboard only knew in a much larger form factor and was unaware of being used as the brains on keyboards. Let's sidetrack a little again regarding fully custom boards. Those can run the same or similar chips. If we take a look at the keyboard designer from before, we can even see a predefined mounting bracket for one. This means you can choose which type of chip your board runs on, depending on your needs. I know we are taking the simplest route here, but I feel obliged to mention the fully custom world every now and again, as I think it's good to know the parallels to that harder track as well. Ergo boards are essentially all the same game, but you can pick the difficulty yourself. Let's get back to the Unicorne, which luckily is set up so you can get started right away. You can change the key mapping using VIA or VIAL, as well as set up your layers like on any other QMK board. The same goes for macros, shortcuts, and so on. I won't be getting into this any further, as it's quite common and very easy to do. Instead, let's take a look at the final configuration I ended up with after 2 months. The thumb clusters are unchanged since day one, and from the left you'll find the Command or Windows key depending on whether you're Team Paperclip or Team Fruit, then the modifier for layer 2 and the space. And then on the right side we have the Enter, modifier for layer 3, and the right Alt key, which I use very frequently to select the dreaded umlaut characters as I navigate through my Swiss German and German day job. This has nothing to do with the keyboard itself. I use EuroKey as my input source to be able to select these while still using an ANSI layout. Back to the mapping. One of my first additions was for the arrow keys, as I use them quite often during editing. I did this right under my right hand, similar to how I had it on my 40% keyboard I used a while back. This way I can activate them straight from my resting position, without moving. This is fantastic and something I always end up liking a lot, to the point that I wonder why I don't just set it up like this on every keyboard. But then again, not every keyboard has dedicated layer modifiers so conveniently close to your thumb. Another configuration I kept from the base setup was the alternate characters you normally find exclusively on the numbers row, now additionally present on the second. You can still activate them with the shift on the first, but that would require to hold 2 modifiers simultaneously, and my finger dexterity isn't quite ready yet for such acrobatics. I also added the media keys to the lower half of the left side because I frantically skipped tracks like an electrocuted squirrel, and the F keys on the first row when activating the third layer. On the far left and right columns of the board you will also find the more traditional modifiers, starting with the Tab, Control and left Shift key. On the right side we have the backspace, which I have set up as delete on layer 2. Below that is the only non-modifier for the single and double quotes, and lastly the escape key. And that's pretty much it. I have a few smaller add-ons like the minus and plus symbols close to where my index finger is, as well as other less frequently used symbols. This setup seems to cover almost all of my needs, or at least those I encountered so far. One thing I haven't figured out yet is how to get tap dancing to work. This is a method of assigning multiple functions to a single key, activated by double tapping and holding or releasing that key. This is pretty cool and something I only discovered while learning about these types of keyboards. Theoretically it's something available on any QMK board, but likely more prominent here due to the smaller number of available keys. I believe I could even set this up in VIAL, but I can't confirm that because my Unicorne isn't recognized anymore, but more on that in a second. I'm quite happy with the rest though, but it took me a while to get here. This layout continuously developed over the last 2 months while I was using the board, adding missing keys whenever I encountered them and changing the positions of others. But what about the other software customization that can be done here? The screens. This is probably the most playful aspect on this board, but as previously mentioned, it is optional. That is if you never look down. On more complex configurations it can be helpful to keep track on which layer you're currently on, but since the basics are still sufficient for me, I have yet to take advantage of that. I only had one goal when I embarked on this, and that was to get the Bongo cat on here. And for this I had to set it up so I could flash the board with a modified version of QMK. Actually, I'm not entirely sure if this was necessary, and I kinda regret doing it because I somehow ended up with the Unicorne not being recognized by VIA or VIAL anymore. I'm sure there's a way to get this back, but I haven't figured out how yet, but that's my issue and not the topic of this video. Anyway, after installing QMK from the GitHub repo to my machine and successfully flashing my board via the command line, I was ready to edit the files. First, I had to add the word counter to the config H file. This took me a while to figure out because there is a specific version needed if you have a split keyboard. I then also had to add it to my rules MK as well as to the Unicorne C file. This is also needed if you just want to display the speed in numbers. We will, however, use it to switch between the different typing animations. Speaking of those, luckily for me, I'm not the first one who wishes for musical furballs. There were plenty of implementations out there already. I used the code from Christopher Rice on GitHub, which I then slapped into a dedicated Bongo H file for easier management and included it in my Unicorne C header, just like I did with the words per minute. I won't be going into the details on how this works, for one because it would mainly be guesswork and also because it's not my code, but basically it switches between 3 animation states depending on your typing speeds. In theory, this can be replaced by any other animation, and I do have a little project I want to venture on if time permits in the future, where I want to get Sonic in here. Walking, sprinting, running, you get the idea. The last part is defining where the cat goes and calling it. This was surprisingly easy to set up in an if-else statement that also contains the layer indicator that board shipped with. This will be on the master side, which is the one connected to the computer, while the secondary now contains the functions for the cat. And that's it, Bongo is online and drumming away to my measly typing speed. If anyone is interested, I can share my exact code, but I'm not sure if this is going to break your VIA or VAL compatibility, so be cautious when you do this. Overall though, at this point I was very pleased with my experience so far. I was very happy about the build, the looks, the cat, all of which gave me much more joy on the peripheral than I had in a long time. That is until I started to type on a daily basis, or to be more precise, attempted to type. I have a bit of a confession to make, as I think my transition to this keyboard was harder than it had to be, because I never learned how to properly touch type. Now, for those of you who don't know, touch typing means not having to look down and orienting yourself along the so-called home row, with both of your index fingers resting on the F and J key, where the little markers are. Don't get me wrong, when I type I never or rarely look down on the board, but whatever system I was using, it was a self-taught jamboree of finger aerobics that would make even the most open-minded typist cringe. One could say it was the Birkenstock of touch typing. This made my transition to the Corne very difficult, as I couldn't figure out how to type on this using my own technique. So I did what I probably should have done years ago. I started to learn touch typing. For anyone who wants to do the same, there's a great course on edclub.com, which is completely free and linked down in the description. For someone who uses a keyboard on a daily basis at work and also off hours typing these 3,000 to 4,000 word scripts, the beginnings of using the Unicorne were absolutely horrible. I was sometimes barely able to type a single word correctly, and even though I didn't consider myself to be a particularly fast typist before, it was still painful to basically start from scratch. I reached about 40 to 50 words per minute after the first week, but only when putting all of my 2 brain cells on 100% load. I spent a lot of my office time in meetings, taking notes and documenting speeches, and here especially, the slow speed was a nightmare. It eventually got so bad in critical situations that I resorted back to pecking. Shame fell upon my entire being for such a disgraceful display. I can only assume this is what it feels like to wear Birkenstock in public. Another area where my self-taught typing caused quite a bit of pain was the usage of my pinkies, or lack thereof. This appears to be my Achilles heel. Even when I play guitar, my pinkies struggle, and often I unintentionally resort back to using other fingers in their place, which happens on the keyboard as well. As Guthrie Govan once said, they are God's little joke, and touch typing, which heavily relies on using your pinkies, made that very clear to me. Other muscle memory issues were less frequent and faster rewritten, like the right thumb now being responsible for the enter key, which at the beginning caused more than one accidental chat submission for when in reality I simply wanted to hit the spacebar. Wait, no! I'm also a lot less confident when it comes to typing, at least for now. Usually I have quite a hard attack, which I've been called out in the comments before. But now the insecurity leads to a constant hover and delay between each stroke, and actually caused my wrists and fingers to cramp up during prolonged typing sessions, kinda defeating the whole purpose of this experiment. After the first month though, it finally started to get better and better, sometimes even reaching 60 to 70 words per minute. But even now, 2 months later, I'm still nowhere near as confident, but I am getting there. Having all required keys just below your fingertips via the layers feels strangely powerful when I get it right, but I also feel strangely better. For example, during the later months of the year, which we are in right now, I often have very cold fingertips. So far, this hasn't happened with the Unicorne. It's a very odd sensation to describe, but I also sit more upright and less crouched and humped over than I previously did. I do feel this is partially due to the higher concentration needed in order to type at all, but it is something that I appreciate nonetheless. But as much as I enjoy typing away on the Unicorne, and as much as I am getting better and better at it, there's also a downside to this, like that every other keyboard now feels wrong. At the moment, it feels like I'm stuck in purgatory, unable to type as well as I did before on a regular keyboard while still learning on how to get up to speed on this one. However, if you already know how to touch type, this transition is going to be a lot easier. I'd also argue that tinkering around on this board, whether that is with the key map or the displays, is a lot of fun and makes the overall experience feel a lot more satisfying, as it's like an ongoing puzzle that keeps evolving. But I don't think this is for everyone. It's a niche within a niche that can go even deeper if you want to. What surprised me though was that it wasn't as difficult as I thought it would be to get started in terms of hardware. Getting familiar with the new way of typing is a struggle, but one that depends on your existing skill set and learnability. But what hopefully came across in this video is how easy it is to get a really cool hardware experience right out of the box without the need to program anything or flash any firmwares. Just like with the other custom mechanical keyboards, this probably has come a long way over the years to make it more and more accessible. I'm probably also just scratching the surface. I don't know what else lies hidden in the lower levels of this dungeon. I need to level up first before I head down deeper. I also want to recommend a few channels I discovered in the last 2 months, like the already mentioned Joe Scotto, Iga and Ben Valek. All fantastic resources covering this subject in much more detail. For now, this is the last video of the year for me. I will make a community post before 2024 ends though, highlighting some of the numbers and giving some love to the busiest commenters, as well as an outlook on what's to come in 2025. There will also be a giveaway again, so be sure to check it out once it drops. I will for sure mention it on Instagram and maybe some other social channels as well. Anyway, thank you so much for being a part. I hope you got some days off in the coming weeks and that you will get some rest from this year. Have a wonderful New Year's Eve, see you again in 2025, and thank you so much for watching. Bye.